Nahida truly exemplifies what it means to be an Archon. She's a step above the rest when it comes to the things that she can do as a Dendro character. Many people already know that Nahida's elemental skill is the focal point of her damage capabilities. You can tap or hold the skill to mark and link up to 8 different enemies together. Whenever you create an elemental reaction on these enemies or deal bloom damage to any of these linked enemies, they'll all take Dendro damage, and that damage scales on both Nahida's attack and elemental mastery. This hit is called her Tri-Karma Purification, and of course, this can only happen at a 2.5 second interval to keep it at least somewhat balanced, but many players realize that this ability is powerful regardless. On paper, not only does it benefit from both attack and elemental mastery scaling, but it also has an extremely low cooldown on both its tap and hold versions, meaning if you delete a wave of enemies quickly, you can waste no time and link up the next wave of enemies. Combine all of this with the fact that her Ascension 4 passive can grant her skill damage bonus and crit rate when you build elemental mastery, up to 80% damage bonus and 24% crit rate at 1000 EM, and you have a potent off-field damage dealer with Nahida. What you cannot see on paper is how strong her skill's Dendro application is. For those who aren't familiar or aren't interested in heavier theory crafting topics like elemental gauge theory, all you need to know is that Nahida's Dendro application is stronger than any other ability we currently have in the game. Let me demonstrate what I mean. If I use any Dendro ability aside from Nahida's skill, like Dendro Traveler skill for example, I can apply Hydro twice for 2 Dendro cores before the Dendro element is removed from the enemy. With Nahida's Tri-Karma Purification, I can apply Hydro 3 times before the Dendro element is removed from the enemy. In fact, Nahida's Dendro application is so consistent, the only thing you can really see here is that with slow enough Hydro application in this demonstration, the Dendro aura will always be on the enemy. In essence, Nahida's Dendro application lasts longer than any other character's Dendro application, and this is exactly what makes her a powerful off-field support that drives reactions, not just a damage dealer. Knowing that Nahida would be a powerful reaction driver, Hoyoverse also gave her a supportive Ascension talent that buffs the active character's elemental mastery by 25% of the highest party member's elemental mastery, which is most often Nahida herself. Aside from that EM buff to the active character, Nahida's Shrine from her Elemental Burst also provides sizable buffs to her own kit based on the party's elemental composition. For every Pyro character in the party, her skill gains a damage bonus. For every Electro character in the party, her skill's trigger interval is slightly reduced, and for every Hydro character in the party, her burst duration is increased. These buffs can only stack twice per element, meaning if you have 3 Hydro characters and Nahida, you'll get the same effect as having 2 Hydro characters in the party. Overall, Nahida has plenty of resources in her kit that both buff her personal damage and provide support to her teammates, which means as you'll see in the build sections of the video, she can choose her artifacts and weapons to lean into either more damage or more support. Nahida's artifacts are definitely the easy half of her build because of the existence of the 4-set Deepwood Memories. The 4-set Deepwood Memories is simply the most consistent option on Nahida for both damage and support because she's one of the best appliers of the 4-set's Dendro Red Shred. Not only does the Dendro Red Shred boost her own damage, but it also boosts the damage of any other Dendro carry or unit that relies on bloom damage from Dendro cores, Hyper Bloom reactions, and Burgeon reactions as well. In rare cases where you're not playing around any derivative of bloom reactions and are also playing Nahida strictly off-field, the 4-set Golden Troop can have a higher damage ceiling, but that's a very specific situation. The same thing can be said about a 4-set Gilded Dreams, where technically it can outperform a 4-set Deepwood Memories for an on-field Nahida, triggering a ton of reactions with her Catalyst normal attacks, but usually the 4-set Gilded and 4-set Golden Troop are run on Nahida when you already have another character holding the 4-set Deepwood in place of Nahida. In essence, most players should just run the 4-set Deepwood to keep things flexible, while veteran players can farm a 4-set Golden Troop or 4-set Gilded Dreams if they can ensure their most used Nahida teams fit the correct conditions to get the value out of the set. As for artifact stats, a supportive off-field Nahida goes triple EM in the Sands Goblet and Circlet. An on-field Nahida that focuses on personal damage rather than reaching the full buffing potential of her kit can replace the Goblet with Dendro damage and the Circlet with crit rate or crit damage. Substat priority remains the same regardless of playstyle, with energy recharge percent, elemental mastery, crit, and attack percent in that order of priority. Energy recharge requirements can highly vary depending on whether or not you have a second Dendro character on the team, but pretty much all solo Dendro teams need no more than 140% energy recharge, which isn't too rough of a benchmark to reach. Because Nahida's best weapons aren't always determined solely by personal damage output, it's extremely difficult to provide a single catalyst ranking that is the end-all be-all ranking. So instead, I'll provide a list of Nahida weapons for an on-field DPS playstyle and then an off-field support playstyle. Hopefully by doing that, you can identify which Nahida playstyle you want to build around on your account and choose from a condensed list of weapons to make the decision process easier. For maximum personal damage, the two clear frontrunners are her signature weapon, 1000 Floating Dreams, and Kagura's Verity. Kagura's Verity is a catalyst that requires frequent skill casts to stack the weapon's passive for extra elemental skill damage and elemental damage bonus, and thanks to Nahida's extremely short skill cooldown, this weapon becomes extremely competitive with her signature weapon for damage output. After these two weapons, there is a huge drop-off in damage output, but 4-star options like an R5 Widsith and an R5 Solar Pearl can be within 15 to 20% of the total damage output of the previous premium catalyst that we talked about. For the Widsith in particular, on catalyst characters that don't deal the majority of their damage through reactions like Ningguang or Wanderer, rolling the 1 out of 3 chance for getting an EM buff would typically plummet your damage or warrant a reset if you're taking on content like Spiral Abyss. The Widsith is slightly better on Nahida compared to those catalyst users because she actually utilizes the EM buff from its passive with an EM damage multiplier, and thus the weapon becomes a consistent option for Nahida even in teams where you're not actually triggering many reactions. Other classic 5-star weapons like Scoured Atlas, Lost Prayer to the Sacred Winds, and Memories of Dust are great stat sticks and don't have very many specialized passives that Nahida cannot utilize, so they are also decent options for an on-field main DPS as well. The only issue with these classic 5-star catalysts is that they have a low damage ceiling and really only outperform Solar Pearl and the Widsith if those 4 stars are at lower refinement level. If you're looking for the completely free-to-play baseline options, you can take your pick between Sacrificial Fragments, Mappa Mare, and Magic Guide in that order of priority. Sacrificial Fragments is a flexible weapon for both on-field and off-field playstyles due to its high EM stat, while Mappa Mare is ever so slightly better than Magic Guide for an on-field Nahida. As for support weapons, let's get the obvious out of the way and say that her signature weapon is also the best option in this playstyle as well. But aside from her signature, we have a couple new options to introduce. Nahida's second best support option is the Wandering Evenstar, which is a limited banner 4-star catalyst. Wandering Evenstar's passive allows Nahida to convert the massive amount of elemental mastery in her build into a significant flat attack buff for the team, including herself, which can even make it a solid option for personal DPS as well, but maybe not as good as the Widsith or Solar Pearl. If you're looking for options that you can attain without pulling on a weapon banner, look no further than Favonius Codex, Prototype Amber, or Hakushin Ring. Favonius Codex may also be popular for an on-field Nahida to proc its energy passive multiple times, but getting the extra energy particles from the passive even just once per rotation already makes it a great supportive option that eases the team's energy requirements. Prototype Amber is a craftable option that saw an uptick in usage recently with the introduction of Furina. The passive that healed the team over time was already somewhat useful for healerless teams, but now the passive can double down as an extra source of fanfare stacks on Furina's elemental burst. For example, one of Clorinda's best teams, which is Clorinda, Nahida, Furina, and Fischl, is a prime example of where this weapon can provide a ton of value since Clorinda's skill, Furina's skill, and Nahida's Prototype Amber can rapidly stack Furina's fanfare for a large damage percent bonus. Moving into Nahida's teams, we're going to keep things short and simple by discussing 3 archetypes that Nahida provides notable impact compared to other Dendro options. I want you to keep in mind that of course there are more than 3 Dendro team archetypes and she fits in pretty much any team that you need a Dendro character. But given that we discussed how Nahida's Dendro application is stronger than any other Dendro unit and how she can be both a support or damage dealer, I want to give you examples of where those strengths are commonly utilized. The first is your classic Hyperbloom team, which remains as one of the strongest and most flexible archetypes in the game. When you combine the Dendro application from Nahida's skill alongside the extra Dendro application that she can provide from her Catalyst normal attacks, this is a situation where you can easily sustain 2 Hydro applicators in a single Hyperbloom team. The common Hyperbloom setup for an on-field Nahida is Nahida, Kuki Shinobu, Xingqiu, and Yelan. If you don't have this exact team, the easiest change that you can make is substituting one of the Hydro Applicators. Xingqiu or Yelan are the fantastic options with Nahida's fast catalyst attacks, but Kokomi and Furina also provide solid off-field Hydro application if you want to replace one of the former two. Using Kokomi also allows you to substitute Raiden Shogun for Kuki Shinobu as the Hyper Bloom trigger, since Kuki Shinobu is no longer the only healer on the team. The second and more drastic change that you can make to the standard Hyper Bloom team is to use Nahida strictly as an off-field Dendro applicator and use Kokomi, Neuvillette, Ayato, or Barbara as an on-field Hydro character instead. The framework that you can follow is Nahida, Kuki Shinobu / Raiden, your on-field Hydro character, and a flex slot. If you're using Kokomi or Ayato, their normal attacks and abilities provide enough Hydro application together to the point where you don't always need to have a second Hydro character. You can actually run a second Dendro character in the final slot like Dendro MC, Kole, Baiju, Yaoya, or Kidara for the Dendro Resonance, or a Cryo character like Rosaria, Diona, Layla, Kaya, or Ganyu for slightly better Dendro core production. Meanwhile, Barbara's Hydro application is slow and almost always wants to be paired with another off-field Hydro character that I mentioned previously, and for Neuvillette he synergizes extremely well with a second Hydro character like Furina, who greatly increases his raw damage. In a similar realm, Nahida excels as a support for Quicken teams, which are often transformed into Quick Bloom teams when we add an off-field Hydro character into a team that utilizes the Quicken reaction. For these teams, Nahida's biggest strength is that she gives a buff to EM scaling damage dealers like Cyno, Alhaitham, Tighnari, and Sethos, but most other aggravate or spread carries can still be viable if you don't have any of these options. The pairing with a Hydro applicator in the third slot allows for the occasional Hyper Bloom reaction from your on-field Electro characters, which also gain a damage boost from Nahida's Elemental Mastery buff. Thus, the standard framework of this Quick Bloom team is Nahida in the first slot, either Cyno, Alhaitham, Tighnari, or Sethos in the second slot, an off-field Hydro in the third slot, and a flex character to finish things off. As per usual, that off-field Hydro character is between Yelan, Xingqiu, Kokomi, and Furina. For the flex slot, if your carry is Electro, then you want to use characters like Fischl, Yaimiko, and Beidou for off-field damage, or Kuki, Dori, or C6 Kujo Sara if you need healing and or buffing utility. If your carry is Dendro, then Nahida already covers the role of generating energy for your Dendro character, and you'll need to pick either Fischl, Yaimiko, Kuki Shinobu, or Raiden Shogun for consistent off-field Electro application to create quicken reactions. The last archetype where Nahida provides significant advantage is the Burn Melt teams. With the way Nahida's skill works, as long as you have consistent Pyro application, Nahida can effortlessly feed the burning reaction during her time off-field, which means you can on-field a Cryo character to get juicy melt reactions. Nahida's biggest competition in this role is Emily because one of Emily's passives reduces the self-inflicted damage when in melee range of a burning reaction, but the downside of Emily is that her AoE capabilities are much worse compared to Nahida. Your framework to follow for building a Burn Melt team starts with Nahida in the first slot, either Riesli, Ganyu, or Rosaria in the second slot, and a Pyro applicator in the third slot. If you're using Ganyu, then Dehya is the most recommended option in the third slot because Dehya's resistance to interruption can help Ganyu let off her charge attacks. If that's not enough, shielding in the final slot with Zhongli or Diona can really help Ganyu players with skill issues, but if not, then a buffer like Bennett or Shenhe can round out the final slot for Ganyu Burn Melt. If you're using Riesli, Thoma is the most recommended option because Riesli's fast normal attacks synergize with Thoma's burst, and Thoma's shielding can mitigate some of the self-inflicted burning damage that you take at melee range. Healers are almost always recommended with C0 Riesli, so look to use healers with low elemental application like Bennett, Mika, Chi-Chi, or Charlotte in the final slot for Riesli Burn Melt. Other combinations that you can use for Pyro application come in duos such as Bennett and Xiangling or Bennett and Kazuha/Sucrose with Pyro-infused Anemo bursts. These options often provide significantly higher team damage output, but they lack any of the defensive utility that characters like Dehya and Thoma provide, so they do require some skillful dodging. Obviously, Nilou Bloom is a fantastic archetype to run with Nahida if you are a Nilou owner, and Burgeon is also a viable archetype as well that is very similar to Hyper Bloom's options aside from replacing Kuki and Raiden with Thoma. Nilou Bloom in particular has a lot of options to consider beyond Nahida, so I highly recommend checking out my full Nilou guide in the playlist on your screen because there's a lot of detail that I won't be able to cover here. With that, I hope you guys enjoyed this updated Nahida guide, and most importantly, I hope this guide was helpful for building the perfect Nahida for your account. Other than that, it's the same as always. I'll see y'all in the next one. Peace.